will give different perspectives on the crisis. Seemingly an insoluble problem that has grown up over several years in Ireland, but also elsewhere, maybe in the UK, very similar problems. Problem was a major issue at the recent general election and has been very topical since. And whilst we could say all the major parties seem to agree on what our destination should be in terms of accommodation numbers and things like that, there's a huge variety and variation in opinions given on how best to get there. So we'll explore that with the three speakers. First speaker in this session is Marion Finnegan, Chief Economist of Sherry Fitzgerald Group, graduate of NUI Galway with an MA in Economics. Marion became the first economist to be employed by a property company in Ireland when she established the research arm of Sherry Fitz in 1996. As Chief Economist and Director of Research, Marion's role involves monitoring and analysis of economic and property indicators in the domestic and international media, and she's also one of the most highly regarded commentators in the industry and has appeared on television, prime time, etc. And Marion was appointed to the board of Sherry Fitzgerald in 1998, so we'll ask Marion first to give her take on what should be done with the crisis. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin, and good morning, everybody. My presentation is really setting the scene, I suppose, for the property crisis. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the demand-supply balance for property in Ireland. So I'm going to begin by looking at the economic position, because clearly we've moved through a very, very difficult recession, and that has had a very damaging impact on all aspects of the wider economy, but very particularly on the property market. And I suppose you could argue that the property market led us into the recession and arguably began to lead us out of it in 2012. So I'm going to set the scene a little bit in terms of the economic backdrop, and then talk to you about the demand factors for property. So what is driving the need for greater accommodation in Ireland, which are largely demographic factors, and then look at how, as a nation, we're responding to that need, where construction activity is and how much units are being developed, and how that demand-supply balance is leading to price inflation in different regions in the country, where the greatest needs are, where we see that market evolving over time. And I suppose the simple summary of what I'm about to say is that we are now in recovery mode in terms of our economy, but our property market is still very, very dysfunctional. And you can see that as we go through some of the data. All the data that I'm presenting today on the property market is determined by our own network of offices throughout the entire country. We sell about 12% of the units that transact in Ireland every year. So we get hard information on every single transaction, which we then use to form our opinion on what's happening in terms of the property market. So to begin with then, in terms of the economic backdrop, this is the Department of Finance view of the Irish economy, where we are now and where it's about to go in the next number of years. The first thing I should say is that these are all pre-budgetary forecasts for 2015, and they've all, to date, as the different stats come through, they're proving to be quite conservative in their nature. So for example, there they had forecast the economy would expand by about 6.2%. There's every indication now that will be in the high sixes, closer to 7% in terms of expansion. They had forecast an unemployment level of 9.5. The end of year figure came in at 9.1, and significantly less than that in the key regional areas around the country. And the positive news really for property, if you're looking at what the key leading indicator for the property market is, it's all around the consumer and employment. So as the unemployment level is being reduced throughout the entire country, that has a very positive effect on the availability of people's need for property. In other words, their ability to buy property. Consumer sentiment leads into their willingness to buy property, and the consumer expenditure figures there of around 3.5% for 2016, while still low enough in relative to where we were a number of years ago, does reflect a consumer who's now confident in recovering and willing to spend again. But unfortunately, property is still quite dysfunctional. Probably the most important economic indicator for property, however, is the labour market. So if you've got areas of very high unemployment, that area will have a depressed property market for a lot longer than those where we see a recovery. So you can see this is the range by region across the entire country of our unemployment levels. The average at the end of the year for the state was 9.1%, but the range was anything from 7.4% in the southwest, led by a very significant recovery in the Cork market, to almost 12% in the southeast, their near neighbours, where unemployment remains a stubborn issue, where it is negatively impacting the recovery in the property sector. The West is close to the average at 10.6%, but certainly Galway within that. If we could get a figure for Galway, the unemployment level is likely to be a lot more healthy than that figure would suggest. But into this recovering property market, we've had significant levels of intervention. And if I could say there is one thing that typifies the property market in Ireland, it is very significant intervention, and it is to its detriment. 12 months ago, in February 2015, the Central Bank released new mortgage macroprudential policies on the regulation of the mortgage industry. Their intention is absolutely laudable and absolutely correct in that they want to regulate and prevent another credit bubble. Unfortunately, when you bring about a change to a market and how lending occurs in that marketplace, the immediate impact cannot be what was desired. And I think the immediate impact on the marketplace has been quite damaging. What these new rules have brought about is they have delayed, particularly first-time buyers' ability to buy property. And some would argue, well, buying property too soon is a bad idea. However, we've had at least 5 years prior to last year where the ability to buy property was severely affected by, or severely hindered by the recession. So we had a lot of first-time buyers, pent-up demand, willing to enter the marketplace, having had reasonable savings there. And what this has done is actually hinder their ability to buy property in the short term. Now, it's more obvious when you look at areas of higher value. So if you look at the Dublin market or the Mid-East market, where values are typically about 30% higher than the country overall, you can feel the very direct impact of the central bank regulatory changes. They also brought out a rule there, you can see in the middle, regarding loan-to-value for buy-to-let mortgages. And really they were stating that there should be an incentive amongst banks to lend into the buy-to-let sector. That, while banks are certainly offering mortgages up to an LTV of 70%, they're at quite punitive rates, and therefore they're not attracting a lot of investors. So we now have a marketplace where we have a growing need for accommodation, where people are being restricted in terms of their ability to buy in the short term, and they need to save a larger deposit, up to 20%, and their loan-to-income ratios are restricted to 3.5 times their income, which is good in its intent, but it does damage the market in the short term. So just to put it in context, if you look at the median value of property in Dublin and the median income level, the relationship between the two is 4.5 times. So for the average property in Dublin, if you're earning an average income level, you will require 4.5 times your income level to buy property, but you can only borrow 3.5 times your income level based on these new changes. So it does damage the ability to buy. The other significant intervention in the last 12 months was around rent certainty. So around the same time, the Minister for the Environment announced that he was going to look at the whole area of rent certainty and the ability to bring in some certainty for those in the rental sector going forward. This, again, there was a lot of discussion around this for several months before we got some final decisions around what that rent certainty would look like. And the legislation came out at the end of the year. And at the end of the year, I would argue that the result was not what it was originally proposed to be. It was actually probably a watered-down version of the original proposals. But in the intervening period, we did see significant concern from investors in the marketplace, investors that were a vital ingredient in the marketplace. And the result of that was restricted levels of investor activity and further pressure in terms of rent. I'll go back to that topic in a moment when we're looking at overall volumes of investor activity and how that's impacting the marketplace. But to look specifically at the demand and supply factors for property in Ireland, first of all, we are looking now today in that we do have the property price register, which gives us at least a glimpse into what's happening in terms of property. It doesn't give us all the details that we would like, but it gives us more data than certainly we had 5 or 6 years ago. So for 2014, I know this sounds old information, but we still don't have final figures for 2015. For 2014, about 42,000 transactions occurred, single transactions occurred in Ireland throughout the entire country, which represented 2.2% of the private housing market. And people often look at that and say, well, is that good, bad? What does that mean? Well, a normal functioning housing market should transact between 3 and 3.5% of its private stock every year. If you look at the UK market today, that's what's happening on the ground. In 2014, the Irish property market transacted 2.2. Our estimate at that point would have been that we would have seen that level growing, that we'd get closer to 50,000 transactions in 2015. I think the market will fall shy of that, partially because of the significant intervention. The figures for the first 9 months showed that activity was up 21%. However, the figures for the first 6 months had shown activity was up about 30%. So we definitely saw a tapering off in activity in the latter half of the year as the full impact of the new mortgage regulations became clear to those trying to invest in the marketplace. So overall, I think we'll probably see 47,000, 48,000 transactions at its utmost for 2015. spread throughout the entire country. It must be said that the greatest impact of the new changes were felt in the Dublin market, which houses 28% of the population, so therefore it did have a big impact on overall activity levels. Just looking at who's buying and who's selling this property, because that gives you a very good indication of the functionality of the marketplace. So these figures are not from the Property Price Register, they're from the Sherry Fitzgerald analysis of our own vendors and purchasers throughout the entire country. And for that reason, they are from a smaller sample than the entire market, but as I said, we have about 12% market share, so it gives you a reasonable indication throughout the entire country. So it was predominantly in 2015 an owner-occupier marketplace. 72% of the properties we transacted were owner-occupiers. And given the location of the conference today, I thought it would be interesting just to look at Galway as well. Galway had a higher level of investor activity. 56% owner-occupiers purchased the properties in Galway, 32% investors, whereas the national average was about 19% investors, and indeed Dublin had lower again at about 14% investors. Now, if you think of a marketplace where we have delayed purchasers' ability to enter the marketplace, more and more people need rental accommodation. The population is growing, and I'll share you some of those figures in a moment, which is putting increasing need on every year for more accommodation. And the investor activity as a result of that needs to be enhanced to supply the buy-to-let property, so those of us who want to rent find that property easily enough. What we have now is quite a dysfunctional marketplace where 19% of those buying are investors, which is quite low relative to the profile of vendors in the marketplace. So there's a lot more vendors leaving the property market in Ireland than we have new entrants in terms of investors, as a result of which we see a contraction in the level of buy-to-let properties available for everyone who wants to rent in a market where the demand is growing. Now, I'll talk to you a bit more about that in a moment. In terms of mortgages drawn down, about 4.9 billion euros in total of mortgages were drawn down last year. Now, because we don't have the final figures for transactions, I can't give you the precise level of cash from that analysis. But for the first 9 months, if you compared the level of mortgages drawn down in absolute terms to the level of transactions, 46% of the transactions had no mortgage at all attached to them. It wasn't that there was a percentage of the overall value. 46% of each individual of the entire transactions had no mortgages attached to it at all. Now, if you think back to the central bank regulatory changes, it was all about preventing a credit bubble. Well, the activity levels for last year and the year before, and the year before, and the year before, typically half of the transactions that took place throughout the entire country had no credit attached to them whatsoever. So it does beg the question why we were looking to prevent a credit bubble at a time when there was very, very low levels of credit relative to the entire marketplace overall. In terms of the need for housing, we have a growing population. At the time of the last census, there was 4.58 million people living in Ireland. We're doing another census on the 24th of April. Early indications would suggest it would be around 4.69 million, which is on target what the forecast had been 5 years ago for population growth. So in the last decade, the population of Ireland has grown by about 12%. With that growth in population, there is a growing need for accommodation in all of our cities in particular, because what we've seen during the recession is population has congregated back in the urban areas. There's been a push towards the urban areas where people are seeking employment opportunities. That population is forecast to grow to about 5 million over the next decade to 2026. In the west, the population growth is quite strong, growing to just under 500,000 in the western region, of which Galway would be a significant driving force. So in terms of the housing need, with that population growth, we needed to be building between 22 and up to 34,000 houses every year to supply the necessary accommodation to house our people as the population grows. Within the western region, that's between 2,000 and 3,000. And if you look specifically at the need for Galway City, we should have been building in the order of 500 to 750 houses per annum in Galway City to meet the growing needs of the population of Galway City. Last year, we built less than 100 in Galway. So 1/5 of the need in the country of the city was actually supplied, most of which will be standalone properties which are not actually coming in and meeting the needs of those moving into the city. So there's a growing shortage with every passing year of accommodation in the country overall. In terms of what we actually built in the state, we built about 1,000 properties every month last year, in total about 12,000 properties. So a need for, in the order, if you average it out over the whole 15-year period, about 25 to 30,000 houses per year, and we built 12,000, half of which were standalone properties that somebody with a half-acre site in Longford or Cavan or wherever it is, building a bungalow by themselves, and we're not actually meeting the needs of growing urban population as a result of that. And Galway City is a classic example of that, building less than 100 houses last year, with a need for somewhere between 5 and 750 units actually every single year for the last 5 years. Just in terms of what's available then, what we do every 6 months in Cherry Fitzgerald Research is we look at the quantity of properties advertised for sale, and this is a very, very useful indicator for what's going to happen in the property market in the next 12 months. So in January of this year, we looked at everything that was advertised for sale on Daft, everything that was advertised for sale in My Home. We merged the data and we cleaned it on a county by county basis and said, what does that mean for the housing stock in every county in Ireland? So in total in January of this year, there were 26,800 units advertised for sale, which represented 1.4% of the housing market. Now, if you think back to what I said about transactions activities, which are around 2.2 or 2.3%, a normal functioning housing market should have at least 1 year's supply, ideally 2, but at least 1 year's supply available for the population to offer choice. So as of January of this year, we had 26,800 units and we had sold in the order of 45,000 the previous year. So we've nowhere near 1 year's supply. But it gets worse when you get into the urban centres. So you look at the Dublin market, it's averaging less than 1%, 0.9% stock advertised for sale in Dublin. Galway City, 0.7% of its stock available for sale as of January of this year. And similar figures for Cork City, 0.7%. Limerick has slightly more, around 1%. But literally every urban centre, all of our regional centres, have less than 1% of their stock advertised for sale, when they're transacting closer to 2.5 or 2.6% of their stock every year. So that represents a critical shortage of properties available to buy. And if you looked at the latest figures from Daft, you can see there's equally a critical shortage of properties available to rent. So we have a recovering economy with a growing population need and very little stock available for our people to either buy or to rent, which is putting significant upward pressure on both rents and capital values throughout the entire country. If you just look at Galway, because we're here, let's look at it in a bit more detail. In Galway City, as of January of this year, there were 220 houses advertised for sale in the entire city, 1,300 in the county. Both of those figures represented a very significant contraction on 12 months previously, when there was very little available for sale. So the biggest crisis for Galway City at the moment is there simply isn't enough accommodation for everybody's needs. People are bulking up in the properties that are available if they're looking to rent, but there is still very significant rental pressure pushing through. Just in terms of who's selling the property, and this will really illustrate the rental crisis, as anyone who is studying here will have experienced in September last year when you were looking for accommodation. If you look at the profile of the country overall, 33% of the stock that we sold last year were investors, landlords getting out of the market voluntarily, for want of a better word, and a further 13% were the bank pushing the investors out of the market. So 46% of the stock that we sold in the entire country last year were investors being pushed or voluntarily leaving the housing market, and only, remember, 19% of the houses were bought by investors. So in summary, for every one investor who bought into the marketplace and became a landlord, 2 got out. So there's no wonder there's a shortage of rental accommodation throughout the entire country. It's just as critical in Galway. We said there was a higher level of investor activity in Galway. There's equally a higher level of investors getting out of the marketplace. 38% of our sales last year were bank repossessions, and another 30% were selling investment properties. So that's 68% of the houses that we sold in Galway City were investors getting out of the marketplace, and only a little over 30% were investors buying into the marketplace. So again, the rule of thumb again, 2 leaving for every 1 coming in, and that's what's pushing the rents up in Galway City overall. The national figures from the PRTB shows rents were up about 8.5% on an annual basis up to the end of the 3rd quarter last year. We don't have the 4th quarter figures as yet. But I think if you look at the core areas, if you get into the cities of Galway, Cork, Limerick and Dublin, you'll find rental inflation significantly in excess of that average figure of 8.5%. And certainly there are examples where it's in the high teens and pushing towards 20% for different types of accommodation. And that really reflects a market in crisis, which is what we're here to talk about today. In terms of price performance, it hasn't been quite as strong in the last 12 months. So the market moved into recovery in 2012, and we saw a significant uplift in values throughout 2013 and 2014, largely led by the Dublin marketplace. But the intervention in the Dublin marketplace, combined with the previous couple of years of very strong price inflation, did see that market cool quite a bit last year. So we saw much lower levels of capital values being pushed through the Dublin market. So the average figure for the country overall came in at 4%. But what I've done here is look at our own index by region in terms of the entire country. So you can see the Galway region and the West overall had capital values growth of about 7% over the course of 2015. The Southwest and the border regions both closer to 10% price inflation. Arguably the border region coming from a very low base when you look at areas like Donegal, where values had been depreciated quite significantly. The Southwest is on the back of 2 years of recovery, so it's very significant price pressures emerging in Cork City at the moment, and a recovery in Kerry coming from a low base in that location. And then you can look at the Dublin market there, where we had very, very significant capital value appreciation throughout 2013 of about 14%, and throughout 2014 of about 18%. And last year, overall, the value of property rose by about 1.4%. And that really and truly reflects a couple of things. It reflects the previous couple of years where we saw that surge in terms of price performance, but it also reflects the intervention in the marketplace where people simply delayed their decision to buy until such time as they could save the 20% deposit in order to get into the marketplace. And I suppose it's quite stark if you compare the 2 years there, 2014, 2015, you can see the intervention in the marketplace and how that impacted price performance. And arguably you could stand here if you're representing those who brought about those changes and say, well, this is a success story. You know, prices in Dublin were growing by 18% in 2014. We came in, we changed the story, and now they only grew by 1.4% in 2015. But the problem is there's no new houses being built, and the market isn't, the problems in the marketplace have not been addressed. We've simply moved it from a position of very strong price growth to very strong rental growth, and we still have no more properties available for our citizens. And that is the biggest issue for the housing market. So I suppose when you start this presentation, it is quite frustrating because you look at it and say, we had such a deep recession and the economy is recovering. Arguably well positioned in the recovery because of what's happening in terms of euro and the very positive impact that's having on our export trade. But we are also seeing an improvement in consumer sentiment. It's back at an all-time high. We're seeing reductions in unemployment levels down to about 7%, 7.5% in our core areas. We're seeing very strong positive investment in our economy overall, and we still have an incredibly dysfunctional housing market. And if the one thing that we could get out of all of the talk that is in Ireland about property is if we could get a plan that lasts for more than 12 months, a need to look at this property market for a 20-year period or a 30-year period where we would say this is what the property market of Ireland needs to supply its needs over the next 20 or 30 years. This is going to be our population growth. This is the amount of houses and unit types that we need, and allow those to be developed so we offer choice for those who want to rent, for those who want to buy, and that it isn't constantly a changing marketplace and a changing environment every 6 months as somebody else comes up with a good quick fix solution, which usually has consequences that weren't intended. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patricia. Next speaker in the set is Ned Brennan. Ned is Chief Executive Officer of Respond Housing Association. Ned's previously worked as a town clerk in Youghal and as a staff officer with Kilkenny County Council. He's educated in Presentation College Bray, University College Dublin, the Honourable Society of King's Inn, and holds a master's degree from UCC. Ned has been a representative of several government bodies. He's been a member of the Department of Environment, Community and Local Government Working Group for the cooperative and voluntary sector from 2000 to 2009, and a member of the board of the Irish Council for Social Housing from 2011 to 2014. Respond as a housing association provide a nationwide service from 9 offices across the country, of course one here also in Galway in Oranmore. So I'd invite Ned to come forward and give his second and maybe a different view on the housing crisis.
Thanks, Martin. Good morning, ladies. Well, it's afternoon now. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You have your lunch to look forward to after Hubert, so I probably the aperitif for the final session today. Just tell you a little bit, two things I'm going to look at this morning. One is tell you a bit about Respond and the voluntary housing sector and what we do. And for the construction students, there's loads of lovely photographs of houses and estates, so that might whet your appetite a little bit. And then I'll talk a bit about, I suppose, carrying on from what Marion has spoken about this morning, the obstacles to the delivery of social housing from my perspective, and some suggestions as to how those obstacles can be overcome. Just to tell you a bit about Respond, we founded in 1982, some 34 years ago. We've built nearly 5,500 houses in that period of time, and we're currently managing a little over 4,000. We have a development programme of 1,400 to 1,700 units over the next 4 years right across the country. And we manage houses in 23 of the 26 counties across the country. I suppose our housing stock kind of divides down into about 75% housing for families and 25% housing for older people. So over the period since our inception, the whole idea of social housing has developed a lot. I suppose a lot of the model that we use is based on the European model, so we've been moving in that direction over the years. So we're more about the provision of, you know, during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was a lot of stigmatised, ghettoised social housing delivered in mono-tenure type delivery. We've tried to move away from that over the last 15 years in trying to develop more integrated type housing. So we've have a variety of houses that are delivered, and we try to get as good a mix as possible, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in a few minutes. I suppose we're also unique in that we have our own in-house design team. It would be unusual for housing associations. Most housing associations would procure their services in relation to architecture and design from private practices. We have our own in-house design team and have had one for the last 20 years. So we provide the following services: design and master planning, procurement and construction, planning and design advice, and energy rating assessment. So we can take a project from a greenfield site and develop it right through to delivery of the keys. So I suppose that has given us some advantage over the years in that by virtue of the fact we have our own in-house teams, it means that we can be more streamlined and faster in delivery. So our teams consist of architects, architectural technologists, quantity surveyors and site agents. So we have the whole array of construction and design services and support staff that are required in the delivery of a social housing product. I'll give you a couple of examples now of some schemes that we have developed. This is an integrated scheme in Monaghan consisting of 165 houses, which is a mix of units that are managed by Respond, local authority houses, and then affordable houses. This scheme was completed about 15 years ago, so that was at a time when the affordable housing scheme was available. So we have a good mix there in that we have family housing, we have housing for older people, and we have affordables. So that's the desire to bring in a market element, and so that's quite a large development. And all supported then by a community building. The community building we see as being the heart of the community, and it's essential. Most of our estates that we would have developed over the last 20 years have a community building because, we see our work commencing really when the tenants move in, and we engage with tenants in a whole variety of programmes, which I will talk about later on. That's another integrated development in Middleton in County Cork of 91 units, a mixture of family units and local authority units that are managed by the local authority and some affordable units. And this is a regeneration scheme in Moyross in Limerick, which were former local authority houses, 31 units, which were refurbished in 1997 by ourselves and converted and managed by ourselves. I suppose the changes that we made there is also that we provided a community building which is the heart of the community and provides a variety of services to that very deprived area. And also we developed a refuge service there for women and children who were out of home as a result of homelessness and a variety of other reasons. This is our biggest development in the country, which is 204 units in Tallaght Town Centre, right beside the Square Shopping Centre and a couple of minutes walk from the Lewis line. So really well served with services, public transport, schools and amenities. This is we developed between ourselves with the support of South Dublin County Council and the Order of St John of Gods, who provide 80 units there in that development for people with intellectual disability. So we have a variety of activities going on there. We have family units, we have units for older people, there are affordable units, and then there are the services that are provided by the Order of St John of Gods. As I mentioned a few moments ago, we really see our work beginning once the tenants move into the house. So our model works around developing and building self-reliant communities. A lot of housing associations just deliver housing and the delivery and management and maintenance of housing. We offer a different type of model where we really focus in on the delivery of support services to our tenants. So all of our tenants would undergo a pre-tenancy course of 6 to 8 weeks before they move into the houses, which creates for them an appreciation of community living and what their responsibilities are and what the landlord's responsibilities are. All of our developments have a community building, and we see that as the heart of the community, where support programs for families and for children and young people can be developed. So we would follow a lifetime cycle where for new estates, we would focus in on the delivery of preschool and after-school programs, and then as the age demography on an estate changes, then we focus in more on youth clubs, support programs for men as in men groups, and then parenting programs, whether it be parenting skills, budgeting skills, household management, but it's all about providing the services to families to ensure that they have the necessary capabilities to be able to manage their own lives in a supportive type of way. Respond was the first housing association to pioneer the development of communal facilities on family estates. And as I say, they include a whole variety of support programs, particularly for children. I suppose the focus on children was twofold. One, that it engendered a regard, a grow for education from a very young age, on one hand, and then on the other hand, the strategy was to free up parents to be able to avail of second chance education in the morning time while children were being minded. And then the other cohort of accommodation that we provide is for older people, for special needs, whether it's people with disability, homeless people, and refuges for women and children. This is an older person's development in Youghal in County Cork called Shalom House. This was a Protestant asylum that was built in the 1820s and had fallen into disrepair. And we were invited in by a local Church of Ireland group to refurbish the development, which we completed in 1994. So it provides 24 self-contained apartments for older people there with support services. This is our latest development, which was only occupied by tenants last month. It's St John's College in Waterford, which is a former diocesan seminary, which we purchased in 2009, and the construction of the project started in late 2013, early 2014. So the old seminary building has been refurbished, and we've also, which you'll see in a few moments, a new build of 22 units also on the site. This was a particularly challenging project because, as you'll appreciate, it is a protected structure and a listed building. So from that perspective, it was quite a high onus on us to ensure that we complied with all the requirements of a protected structure, both internally and externally. But it's turned out to be a fine building, and you can see more details of this leading project on our website. This is a regeneration project in Blackpool in Cork. These were the former local authority Glen Flats, which have now been developed into a mixed tenure development of 51 homes, consisting of 12 units of accommodation on the ground floor for families. This is a podium. This area here is a podium garden. Then we have 12 units of accommodation for families at ground floor level. Then we have 41 units of accommodation for older people. At the back there's a 16-person group home for people with intellectual disability, which is managed by the Cope Foundation. And then on the top floor we have an array of daycare facilities for older people that are living in the development and from the wider community. So we take in an average of between 20 and 25 people per day. There's a social programme in relation to arts and crafts and things of that nature. There's a hot meal in the middle of the day. And then we've teamed up with the HSE, and they provide quasi-healthcare supports as well. So there's a physiotherapy suite there, there's assisted bathing, there's podiatry and chiropody, and there's a counselling service. So while it's a facility for the people in it, it's a far more important facility for the wider community, because otherwise people from that side of the city would have to travel into the city centre to avail of those healthcare services, which they can now avail of at their own doorstep in this development. And that's just the variety of programmes that we provide for older people. I suppose in the last couple of years we've very much focused in on activation programmes for older people to try and combat social exclusion and isolation. So there's been a big focus on gardening, horticultural programmes, Go for Life fitness programmes, and programmes around nutrition, which have all had very beneficial effects on our tenants living in these particular developments. So mixed tenure has been our main focus. This is another development in Ardroo and Athy, which consists of nearly 100 units and also includes traveller accommodation. So it's very much a mixed tenure development with family homes, accommodation for older people, and then affordable accommodation as well. I think, you know, the way forward to try and end the stigma of social housing is to move more towards the development of mixed tenure estates. So I suppose in the current market, as has been outlined by Marion there, where there is such a lack of accommodation, I think there's probably more of an appetite for the development of good quality mixed tenure accommodation, as long as they're delivered at good locations that are well serviced, like the one I spoke about earlier on in Tala, where they're well serviced by schools, by shop, by public transport. And I think, you know, moving forward, I think we can also knit into these developments the delivery of private rental housing as well, where the facilities are good and the accommodation is of a high quality. This is an unfinished, a ghost estate in Tullow in County Carlow, which was bought from NAMA and refurbished by ourselves, and now is accommodating 53 families. The accommodation was to a very high, the quality of the housing was to a very high standard, but was unfinished. And we completed that in 2014, 2015. And as a result of the delivery of this development, we were actually able to wipe out the waiting list for the Tullow electoral area in County Carlow. A lot of the ghost housing or the unfinished estates have been taken up now, but this was certainly a very good example of how something that was a failure to an extent was able to be converted into something for the benefit of the local community. I'll now have a quick look at some of the challenges that we face in the delivery of social housing. I suppose these challenges that we face as a society, both from a personal, interpersonal point of view, and also from an economic point of view. In the last assessment of housing needs, it said that there was 90,000 families in need of housing. There's an assessment being done next month, and it seems to indicate that we're moving more towards now the need probably of about 140,000 families. There's currently 5,000 families homeless, including 1,500 children. A lack of private supply, as Marion has so eloquently outlined earlier on this morning, and a lack of Part 5. You know, if 12,000 units were delivered last year and half of those 6,000 were once-off houses, that left probably about 6,000 that were going to come under the remit of Part 5. So that would deliver 600 houses in the whole economy. 600 houses at a time where there's a need probably for a minimum of about 6,000 social houses per year. So the delivery by the Part 5 mechanism is very insignificant. And then slow approval processes. The Housing Strategy 2020, which was launched in November 2014, spoke about the delivery of 35,000 houses at a cost of 3.8 billion over a period of 6 years. It promoted mixed tenure development, and it saw that the needs of 75,000 households will be met by HAP, which is the Housing Assistance Payment, and that there was a programme of reform outlined for social housing delivery and management in Ireland, and that by 2020 local authority waiting lists would be cleared. Just a little bit of analysis of that. How achievable is 35,000 in the period of 6 years from last year, 2015? I think it's totally unachievable based on the output from the economy. And if you take a mechanism such as Part 5 as being identified as a major part of the delivery, it's just not going to happen. And even the figure of 3.8 billion has never been broken down as to actually how that amount is going to be, how it's going to be made available. A lot of the finance is up in the air. There is no strategic implementation programme per se of what's going to be delivered in each year, who's going to deliver it and how much it's going to cost. And a lot of this 3.8 billion is predicated on housing associations being able to leverage additional private finance, which really hasn't come to fruition at this point in time. How realistic is the focus on the private sector delivering? And based on the very slow increase in output, it's totally unrealistic that one could expect the private sector to ramp up and deliver what's expected. And, you know, particularly as Michael Stone was saying earlier on, in 2006, there was 30,000 young people in apprenticeships. Today, there's 6,500. A lot of the skills in the area of masonry and electrics and plumbing has been lost to the economy during the downturn period. People have emigrated to Australia and Canada and England, and maybe a lot of those that won't come back. And if you don't have the skills for the delivery of accommodation, how are you going to deliver accommodation? So I feel that there's a major challenge facing the economy, not alone in the delivery of social housing, but also in the delivery of private housing. And a lot of this in relation to delivery of 75,000 houses under HAP is a sleight of hand in reality, because you're transferring people from the current rental subsidy scheme or under the RAS, which is the rental accommodation scheme, and supplementary welfare allowance. You're just transferring existing tenants from those programmes into the HAP programme. So you're actually not delivering any new units, you're just transferring people from one mode of subsidy to a new mode of subsidy. And one of the main pillars was the development of a cost rental model to attract landlords into delivering new accommodation. And as Marion has just pointed out, there's two landlords, for every one landlord that's entering the private rental sector, there's two leaving. So the proposition that we're going to have a cost rental model developed in this economy, I don't see it as being realistic. The results so far, government have provided 17,000 houses in the last year and a half, but most of those are transfer from supplementary welfare allowance to HAP, so actually no new units have been delivered. 2,500 local authority voids have been refurbished. The target for this year is 12,000 units, which is, I can't see how it's going to be met. The government have changed the requirement that that approved housing bodies no longer need approval for the development of schemes of less than 20 units. They can be now approved of by the local authority without having departmental approval. The way forward, these are just a few proposals on ideas that might assist in greater delivery of social housing. The release of land banks, the establishment of a housing authority or a specialised vision in the Department of the Environment, the delivery of fast-track planning for social houses for a period of time under the same model as the strategic development zones that have been rolled out in the Docklands in Dublin and in South Dublin County Council. Those type of strategic development which would deliver planning, maybe, for a period of time to bring in this fast-track planning for a 5-year period. The increase of output from Part 5, a government guarantee for the borrowings of AHBs, the investment in new technologies. In Amsterdam, you can build a house in 83 days for €73,000 in the heart of Amsterdam, and that's because they embrace new technologies. As it was mentioned by Michael earlier on, there's a lot of development of technologies off-site. So in situ building with the use of casing, the construction of roofs, the construction of pods for bathrooms and things of that nature would really speed up the delivery of housing in this country. And then if the government was to make seed funding available for AHBs, it would assist them in enhancing and speeding up the development of their programme. And then the development of supports and facilities for a functioning housing sector. The supply of land is a major challenge to the AHB sector. There's quite an amount of land that's held by state departments, that's held by local authorities, and that's held by NAMA, which isn't made available for the delivery of social housing. We're proposing the establishment of an agency that would manage the identification, and a lot of it has been done already, of land banks, and then the creation of a pipeline to direct that land banks into delivery of social housing. Capacity building, as I've alluded to a few moments ago, the development of a single point or central unit. There's an enormous amount of bureaucracy in getting a project approved between the local authority and the Department of the Environment. I just gave an example there earlier on. We have an 11-unit scheme in Cork City, which we first started planning 11 years ago. We have a tender which is a year old yesterday, and we still haven't got across the line to get it on site. There's toing and froing, there's red tape. Every time a series of queries are raised by the department and you answer them, a new series of queries are raised. So it just slows down the whole process in the delivery of housing. The new funding schemes under CAF and Payment and Availability Agreement are working quite well, but there is a need for further investment, and we're proposing the establishment of an off-balance sheet financial vehicle, an SPV, which would allow the larger AHBs to come together to be able to access bond finance in the European markets. And we're also proposing that under Part 5, which was the 2000 Planning and Development Act, where there was a provision for 20% social and affordable housing. That was reduced under the new Planning Act last year to 10%. We're recommending that it goes back to 20%. That would have some impact in delivery. And then there's a whole variety of choice and housing support programs, which I've kind of outlined earlier on in relation to supporting families in the delivery of accommodation. Financial supports are important in relation to the government guarantee, would certainly create a level of stabilisation for the AHB sector. The AHB sector is new and I suppose is untested in this economy. Compared to the UK, where housing associations have been delivering houses for 60 years and bank finance has been readily available for the last 30 years. We don't have the same housing economy here in Ireland, and the private lending institutions are nervous about lending because it's a whole new scenario. We're maintaining if there was a government guarantee which would never be called on in reality, because if a housing association was to fail, then the local authority would step into the shoes and take over the management of the property, or would hand it on to another housing association to manage. Partnerships are important. Partnerships have existed for the last 30 years with local authorities, and it's important that these partnerships are further developed, particularly in relation to local authority stock transfers or the delivery of maintenance support programs to local authorities. There's an enormous amount of duplication in our sector. You know, each local authority has a housing management system, each AHB has a housing management system. We have a duplication of staff, we have a duplication of maintenance functions. So the coordination and delivery of one-stop shop type supports in relation to the management and maintenance of housing would certainly lead to economies of scale and a streamlining of delivery. And we're strongly of the view that in relation to delivery of social housing, that there should be social contracts also weaved in to construction contracts, which would benefit local employment in such areas as employing young people in the apprenticeship area. So that completes my few words this morning. That's the other side of St. John's College. That's the new build, the 22 apartments beside the old seminary. So thank you all very much for your time and attention this morning.
So, thank you, Ned. Our final perspective in the set will be from Hubert Fitzpatrick. Hubert is Director of Housing, Planning and Development at the Construction Industry Federation. He's responsible for a range of policy functions there, including finance, banking matters, taxation and budgetary policy, including housing and development, obviously under the theme today. And has also been heavily involved in the registration process for the Construction Industry Register, known as CIRI. Is a director of also of the Irish House Builders Association, director of the Federation's Eastern Region. So I'll ask Hubert to give the final perspective in this set. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin, and much of what I'm going to say I broadly agree with everything that Marion and Ned stated, but I suppose with the exception of one key issue, and Ned made reference to the fact that he supported the restoration of 20% requirement under Part 5, and in an environment when in many cases the cost of building is higher than the market value of the completed product. The restoration of a 20% requirement for the Part 5 simply is not sustainable and can't be borne by the industry. We certainly welcome the change to 10%, and we'd have alternative views that even the 10% is difficult to manage in many parts of the country. But to start off, is Ireland alone with the current problem it has? It's not. In England, our closest neighbour, there's 312,000 units required annually for the next 5 years, and they're delivering about 155,000 units. And in Ireland, just on an average basis, up to 2020, there's about 25,000 units required, and about 12,600 were delivered in 2015. Well, what was the real level of building activity in 2015? I would say that it was closer to 8,000 or 9,000 units max, because many units that were completed in 2015 were actually, some of them were mothballed from previous years that they would have started, perhaps in 2006, 2007 or 2008, and were never finished. And the completion figures are measured by ESB connections. So many units might have had a roof on, be weathered, and because they were finally completed and connected to electricity supply, that referred to a completion. So the real level of building activity that took place in 2015 would be significantly less than the 12,600 units. The UK has responded to its problems, and it has 3 principal initiatives. It is an affordable housing initiative, it's a Help to Buy initiative, which it launched in 2013, and under the Help to Buy, 62,000 sales to date have been supported by that scheme, and 1/3 of all the sales for major house builders have been supported under that scheme. And they're now introducing another scheme, a starter home scheme, which is primarily going to compete maybe with the Help to Buy scheme. But they're recognising that they have a major difficulty in England, and they're bringing forward solutions to help people get on the property ladder. 80% of all Help to Buy deals have been taken up in the UK, have been taken up by first-time buyers. And the Help to Buy scheme and the starter home schemes, they're competing for the same market. But Help to Buy means that, you know, state in effect takes a 20% equity in the house, the purchaser takes on 80%, and over the next number of years the purchaser can then go back and purchase out their interest in the overall scheme. And it is an initiative that we as an industry have supported to government, and we'd like to see some action on, but I'll touch upon that later on in the presentation. What have we in Ireland today? Well, I would call it as a broken market. You know, if we look at the level of house building activity, you know, the required units in urban areas, I'm excluding rural parts of the country. This was a study that was carried out by the Housing Agency, and they said that in 2016, for instance, there's 17,100 units required in urban areas. 2017, 19,400, 2018, 20,900. But if we look at the activity in 2015, for instance, there was only about 6,600 units built that were of scheme units, that were more than one-off units. 40 to 50% of the units that have been built in the country today have been one-off units, which are not dealing with the other major demand we have in the urban areas. The number of units commenced, 2014, 7,700 units commenced. 2015, 8,093. So when you look at the completion levels of maybe 12,000 units versus the commencement activity, that is broadly reflective of the number of units that were started in earlier years that are now just being completed. So the risk factor is that you could actually see completion activity fall in the next year or two unless something happens in order to address the current problem we have within the market. So Ireland is no longer one housing market, but it's a series of contrasting markets. I mean, the activity is recovering in Dublin and the Greater Dublin area, in the cities in Cork, and start to recover in Galway. But there are many, many parts of the country where literally you can buy a house for 60, 70% of what the construction costs would be. And until that issue is adequately resolved, you will have no increased level of house building activity taking place in these areas. So something has to happen. Either costs must be cut or prices must increase. There is uncertainty and difficulties for purchasers obtaining adequate mortgage approval. And this is what Marion has certainly elaborated on in her presentation. And we're talking about the central bank macroprudential policy here. Development finance, that's expensive and difficult to secure. Many builders do not have equity on their own balance sheet at this juncture, and they must actually purchase in that equity in order to enable them build. Banks will generally fund up to 60% development finance. The remaining funding has to be raised by a form of mezzanine funding or purchasing of equity. And in many cases, the cost of that funding can be 10, 12, 14%, which actually makes building extremely difficult in these areas. Ready-to-go development land with services and planning. While plenty of land is zoned, when one looks closely at the land, a lot of it is not serviced and a lot of it is not ready to go. We have had, the public capital programme has been cut significantly during the downturn. We do require water or wastewater services to be laid onto a lot of land. There's still an requirement for roads. But if you look at certain areas, up to 50% of the land is not capable of being developed in the short to medium term until significant infrastructure is provided. Smaller traditional house builders are finding it difficult to compete, to purchase land and secure funding. A lot of the land sales that have taken place over the last year or two have been via major loan sales, and it's only large funding bodies were able to come in and buy those loans and then subsequently deal with particular land. individuals who want to buy land who hasn't got planning, there's no funding available for that. So clearly, anybody buying land must have equity. They must be able to take the risk. Planning is land requiring planning permission is not being funded by the banks at this juncture. It has to be funded by equity. And that's a risk that the banks are not prepared to bear at the current time. I've referred to the fact that replacement cost is higher than market values in some areas. And until that balance is addressed, you will have little to no new house building taking place in those areas. Do we reduce cost or increase prices? We look at a €300,000 house. That is actually €264,000 plus VAT of €35,500. There's zero rate of VAT applicable in the UK. And we've significant incentives for first-time buyers in the UK. Development levies can vary from maybe €10,000 in some areas to an extreme case, they're up to €60,000 in an area in Kiltiernan in Dublin. And if you have development levies of that scale, you might as well not have the land zoned, because nothing is going to take place in those areas until that issue is actually addressed. Part 5, 10% of land requirement is required for Part 5. We would say, why has a first-time buyer who's buying their own, trying to buy their own house in an area, have in effect to contribute to Part 5? Because it must be borne by somebody, and it has to be borne. The costs of complying with Part 5 has to be added on to the house price, and that is a price that a first-time buyer has to pay. The overall tax take from new houses is 36%. When you take VAT, development levies, and all the other related taxes that are applicable on housing, it's 36%, and that was affirmed by Grant Thornton in a study that they did for us last year when we were making a submission to the Department of Finance. Question of Section 48 development levies. Section 48 development levies are applicable for general infrastructure to be provided within the local authority area, in many, most often very remote from the development site in question. They were introduced at a time when you had no property tax. We now have local authority property, we now have property tax. So, should the Section 48 levies be abolished for new housing, and that the property tax, in effect, fund the development that was required to be funded by the development levies. There's a table, I'm not sure if you can read here, as I set out on the deposit and loan-to-income requirements in respect of particular prices of houses. And if one was dealing with a purchase price of a house of €250,000, in that situation, the deposit required is €28,000. The repayments over 25 years would be €1,135, and the combined income required to buy that are €63,000. If you head up to €350,000 house, 48,000 of a deposit requirement, and the income, the combined annual income required to get that loan will be €86,000. It's very, very, very high, and that's what's causing the difficulty at the moment. People cannot get mortgages having regard to the loan-to-income requirement or indeed the deposit requirements. And because people cannot get loans and there's no certainty of it, the industry can't respond, because the industry is only able to build houses when it knows that the purchasers are out there and able to secure mortgage approval. And people go out now and they can look at a show house. If they like a show house, they can put down a booking deposit to buy a house on it. But they must prove that they have the capacity to borrow and that they've loan approval in place. If they can't get loan approval, the developer, the house builder, cannot get his development finance. So you're caught in a catch-22 situation, and it's an issue that has to be addressed. The minimum number of units required. We had an undersupply of 4,000 units in 2014. The new supply requirement in 2015 was 16,000. We saw there was about 12,000 units provided. 2016 new supply requirement is 20,000 units. We'll be lucky if we have 12,000 units provided this year. So, on an overall basis, we can see the shortfall in housing supply continue to develop, which is causing major problems. At the same time, we're coming out of a prolonged recession, but our population has continued to grow, and we've had continuous population growth in Ireland for the past 25 years. We've had no house building taking place for a number of years, so clearly that has to be addressed. We had 1.65 million households in the state in 2011. That grew by 630,000 from 1991. So household growth continued despite the recession, and that contributed to a significant reduction in the oversupply of housing that pertained. Ireland's household size is declining steadily. It still is significantly higher than the EU average size, but because it's declining, that's contributing to an increased demand for housing. Marion had a slide very similar to this. You can see our house completion levels, how they hit 90,000 units there in 2007, and how it has fallen back, where we're starting to increase at the current time. House completions compared to 2006, you can see where Ireland was totally out of kilter with what happened throughout the rest of Europe. But the problem was that the houses were built in the wrong locations, and we didn't have the significant oversupply in any of the cities. The supply was in areas where there was no real demand. Vacancy rates were significantly lower in the Greater Dublin area according to the 2011 census. You can see that it was the likes of Dublin, Meath, Dublin, Wicklow and Kildare that had the lowest vacancy rates, and the highest vacancy rates were in Leitrim, Longford, Roscommon and Cavan, all counties which I think benefit from the rural renewal tax incentives, and we can all look back and see where mistakes were made in the past. This is taken from the Daft report, which seeks to compare the cost of renting to the cost of buying. And if we look at Galway, for instance, if a mortgage for a one-bed apartment would be €251 per month. The cost of renting would be €444 a month. You have a similar problem, €493 per month to rent a two-bed house, and a mortgage would be €293 a month. So it's actually more expensive now in many parts of the country to rent than to buy. And this is referring back then to our central bank macroprudential policy. In many cases where people are renting, it's impossible for them to save a deposit. And in fact, if they were able to buy, they would be better off because they would have more money in the pocket. But that's not addressed whatever in the central bank requirements, and it's an issue that we think should be addressed. What has been the government response to date? Well, they've introduced new apartment guidelines to reduce construction costs, primarily in the cities. It has reduced the number of cores that can be required, and reduced the requirement for dual aspect, and has made provision for studios in purpose-built schemes. We had a situation that some city councils increased the standards for apartments over and above the DOE standards, and that resulted in driving the costs up, that it wasn't affordable to build them. So I would hope that the guidelines introduced by government will reduce construction costs somewhat. It's part of a solution, but not the total solution. It has introduced a waiver scheme of Section 48 development levies for schemes of greater than 50 units in Dublin or Cork, where sales prices are less than €250,000 in Cork or less than €300,000 in Dublin. But it's not adequate because in both Cork and Dublin, it's very difficult to secure a house at less than those prices. And I think it's quite restrictive in terms of 50 units. And I think they should introduce a further waiver of Section 48 development levies for a period of time in order to make building affordable and to increase supply moving forward. Schemes have been introduced where money is available, development funding is available for housing. Activate Capital has been established in conjunction with the NTMA and KKR, but the funding cost of its development finance is 10% plus about 2% of sales. It's still very, very expensive. The government will state that the price that they launch their funding at must be competitive with other funders, and it cannot confer any unfair competitive advantage to activate capital over and above other funders. But it's like that cost of funding is difficult, and it means that development in many cases still is not viable. We have the Ireland Strategic Investment Fund in place. That is a fund of 7.4 billion, and part of that fund is to fund real estate, which is housing, social housing investment, commercial real estate, and so on. But it will fund housing-related enabling infrastructure in large-scale priority development areas in order to try to kickstart funding. But projects will be assessed on a case-by-case basis, and they want to look at various funding models, how they can be innovative to make that available. But, you know, it's still for significant large schemes, innovative solutions. It's not going to help with the ordinary small-scale scheme that's required in many parts of the country. What options are open for consideration? We would say that while we welcome the central bank policy, and it certainly has a role to play in protecting the banks and ensuring that we do not repeat the mistakes of the past, I do believe that the policy needs tweaking. The loan-to-income ratio of 3.5 we feel is too restrictive. A rate of 4.5 applies in the UK. Perhaps it should be increased to 4.5. The deposit requirement, the threshold is 10% up to €220,000 and 20% above that. Certainly if you're buying in some of the city areas, the 220, you can't get a first-time buyer house for €220,000, and perhaps that should be increased to 280,000 to 300,000, and maybe apply the 20% requirement for deposit thereafter. Section 48 development levies, I've referred to that already. We think that the property tax is in place now. That should replace the Section 48 development levies. The VAT rate at 13.5%. We've zero rate in the UK. We had a special 9% rate introduced in respect of the tourism sector, which was hailed as a great success. We have sought that rate should be introduced for residential building for a period of 2 years, and just to try to stimulate building activity, try to make it more affordable to build in many areas. And it would actually have a significant difference in terms of overall build costs. First-time buyer incentives, a Help to Buy scheme, you could restrict it to people where joint incomes are less than €60,000. Introduce it for a couple of years. And if you do that, it's actually going to curtail the growth of social housing waiting lists that Ned talked about. And we believe that that would be significantly cheaper for the state as opposed to do nothing. The people have a difficulty putting together a deposit, and that is going to be a problem for years to come. And we've suggested, why not have an incentivised savings schemes, particularly for first-time buyers who are going to buy their first home, and run it on a trial basis for a couple of years. And that would actually assist people in putting the deposit together. If it transpires that they don't spend it on purchasing a principal private residence for themselves, it should then be subject to tax. But it would be an incentive to help the first-time buyer address their own problems. Conclusion, a balance must be achieved between construction costs, market value and affordability. And clearly it's out of kilter at the moment. There are places in the country where you can still buy a 3-bedroomed semi-detached house for €110,000 and less in some cases. You're not going to have building taking place when that market prevails. At the same time, you have to ensure it's affordable. You have to ensure that people can get an adequate mortgage and that they can afford it. And we must have a situation where market value actually does give a builder a margin on construction costs in that he can fund his risk. Because no bank or funder will advance monies to a developer in order to build in an environment of that nature. There must be access to ready-to-go development sites for smaller builders. And they don't exist in many parts of the country. There's a lot of land zoned, but at the same time there's still a lot of land that's not serviced and ready to go. And banks and funders do not want risk and do not want any planning risk going forward. And they will only be interested in a project when it's really ready to go and all the planning and infrastructure issues have been de-risked out of it. We need assurances that mortgages are available to purchasers. I went to the launch of a scheme during the past weekend, a new house scheme, and the key issue there for the agents is that the people who want to put a booking deposit down for a house have to be able to produce evidence that they have their mortgage, and that they're able to enter into an unconditional contract to purchase that unit within the next 21 days. And if they don't do that, there's no point in putting a deposit down for the house. And then when the builder doesn't get those assurances, he's constrained from going on and building the next phase. Costs are rising due to pressure in skills and labour costs. So, you know, some people would say, reduce the cost of building the house. What can you reduce? Wages and input costs are increasing. So it's also, we did look at the cost of building a house in the UK compared to the Irish costs. And by and large, the hard building costs of a house in the UK and here in Ireland are identical. The only difference in cost is the other add-ons. A lot of it is related to the development levies, the financing costs, and the VAT. And that accounts for the differential between UK prices and Irish prices. We need to increase output in the right locations and at the right cost, and that's critical. And the difficulty at the moment is that the housing crisis is affecting the country's competitiveness. And a lot of the issues being raised now by FDI companies setting up in our cities is there accommodation available for the workforce? Is that posing a problem? And if we end up with a situation where we cannot have adequate, affordable housing accommodation available for workers and new businesses setting up, we run the risk of losing those businesses. And that is a serious issue from Ireland Inc. as a whole. So that's me, Chairman. Happy with that. Thank you.
So I suppose quite a bit of commonality between the three speakers, but also some key differences. So we can see if there's any questions from the floor of the panel. Any questions? Gentleman in the front. Come back.
Hello. Hello? Yes, okay, Mark Kane here. A question for Sherry Fitzgerald and for Respond. How do you see the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act 2015 applying to the industry, both the voluntary housing sector and the residential, private residential sector?
First of all, the final bill that was enacted, it was possibly less than we had originally anticipated. I would have had very significant concerns had there been a greater level of rent certainty brought into the marketplace on the basis that we are losing so many investors out of the marketplace. It did have a damaging impact. The noise around that potential change did have a damaging impact on the multi-family investor profile, which just came to a halt for about 4 or 5 months there last year. I think we're at a point now in a cycle where the critical issue is greater volume of investors coming into the marketplace to facilitate the entire market. I think what was brought in was a much watered-down version of the original plan. I don't see it as damaging. I think it's a positive impact for the market to bring in greater regulation. I don't see that as a particular challenge for the marketplace, but we still haven't resolved the issue that we don't have an adequate quantity of investors willing to invest in the marketplace for a variety of reasons. But a lot of those reasons are centered around tax, and we've reached a position now where a private investor is significantly taxed to buy a single investment property. But if you structure yourself in a REIT or QUAIF, you can invest in the marketplace and pay very, very little, if any, tax. So what we need to look at is we do need a functioning investment market where there are a multifamily professional investor, where there are also private individuals investing in the marketplace, which there is in every developed property market in the world. That is a necessity in Ireland. So I think we need to stand back now and look at what are the obstacles to investor activity, ensure that there's an adequate regulation in the industry for those who are renting, but also ensure that there are not obstacles for those who invest and provide accommodation.
Yeah, we would welcome particularly the tenants' security proposals in the legislation. and anything that gives tenants greater security of tenure would absolutely have to be welcomed. I suppose the elephant in the room is that the 130,000 family tenancies in local authorities haven't been given the same support or the same securities as those who are in the private rented sector or those who are now in the housing association sector.
Hello, my name is John Hassett. I'm a doctoral student within the built environment in Ruskin University in London. And we seem to have a plethora of problems in the construction industry in Ireland. My question would be for CIF and for Sherry Fitzgerald. You know, we can talk all night about what we can do for the construction industry, what we can do for it, what the construction industry cannot do. The one thing we have to get right is the funding. We have to get more money released by the financial institutions. We can pontificate for weeks on end in this presentation about how we can do it, how we can't do it. If we can't get the funding in place at correct amounts for the people that are applying for the funding, people on, say, 40 to 50,000 euros per year, have to come up with deposits of approximately cost of the house. In Dublin, that could be as high as 60,000. On the West Coast, it could be as high as 40,000. What can you say to the new government of the day that is coming in? What can you suggest the government to do with regard to funding, release of mortgages, and more control and directives over our financial institutions? Get off the seat, get the money out, get lending, and get business going in the construction industry, in particular in the housing sector. I think it was CIF mentioned in his presentation. I think it was 46% of all purchases that took place last year. 46% of all purchases that took place last year were from private equity. They were in pockets of Asian investors. So in particular, the banking crisis is where I'd like to see the question coming from. Unless we get the banking crisis sorted out and in order, we can pontificate all we like. Very, very little.
In terms of affordability and houses, I think the bank should be concerned with ability to pay without rigid interpretation of the guidelines that are there. I think if somebody has demonstrated a capacity to pay a rent over a period of years, which is equivalent to the mortgage repayment, that should be reason and security for the banks to justify that we can actually pay for that. Where the deposit is a problem, we do advocate the introduction of the equivalent of the Help to Buy scheme that they operate in the UK. And that can apply for up to 20%. It means that the government could actually take an equity stake of up to 20% in a house. And that would enable a person getting a foot in the market. I'm not, we must ensure that there are guidelines in place to ensure that people do not borrow, that they do not overstretch themselves. But I think where they can demonstrate the capacity to rent, that should be adequate. And I think the government's 20% equity loan under a Help to Buy scheme will actually address a lot of people that are otherwise falling on social housing waiting lists. That in turn will actually give confidence to the industry to go back in and start building in some areas and secure the development finance to be able to start.
I agree with everything Hubert has said there. I mean, we definitely have an issue in terms of mortgage lending in the country. If the figures, if I'm right on my memory, it's 4.9 billion lent into the marketplace last year, and I think when the final figures come through, it will be somewhere close to 10 billion worth of sales. So a market that clearly isn't functioning correctly. Property's always been a leveraged asset, so people typically borrow up to 80% or probably more in a first-time buyer's case to buy the asset. So clearly there's an issue there. But I think it's a broader issue, and the marketplace is so intertwined that it's not just first-time buyers' ability to buy, it's also those who are renting, paying increased rental levels and not being able to save as much in order to get a deposit together. So everything is intertwined with each other. So I think we need to stand back, and I think it was one of the areas you ourselves and many occasions, we do need an minister of property who says this is a very essential ingredient in the property economy. We need to understand the dynamics of the entire marketplace, and when we're trying to control a credit bubble like the central bank did last year, there's no doubt that made the position of social housing and responding incredibly challenging, simply because the market is all part of the one side. So mortgage finance is a problem, ability to rent at reasonable rent is a problem, and in fact development finance is equally a problem, which is now developer borrowing money to build, paying double-digit interest rate in order to get that finance. So we have a huge cycle of issues that we need to address, and it's going to take some time to get it.
Yeah. Let's take one last question. Right. Mindful we were between yourselves and your lunch. You've worked very hard this morning, so I won't do much longer.
A question for Hubert, please. Hubert, in your introduction you referred to Syria, the registration of contractors. Could I ask you what's been the uptake on that registration process? I'm speaking as a person who deals in the front line building on a daily basis and an advocate of the legislation when it came in, or the registration process when it came in, but it has seemed to fall away a little bit.
At the minute, there's about 850 builders registered under that scheme. There's about 1,000 applications in the pipeline. And as we go into Construction 2020, government strategy for the construction sector, they had as a key action that Surrey would be put on a statutory footing in 2015. It's my understanding that the Department of the Environment is still fully supportive of putting Surrey on a statutory footing. If one looks at Building Control Amendment regulations, there's significant reference made to Surrey in the regulations. All the commencement notices and the completion certificates for the Surrey registered number of the builder. In terms of guidelines that have issued for inspecting buildings and works on Building Control Amendment regulations, it talks about competence, and the department guideline says that any builders registered with Surrey are considered competent for the registration profile. So I think all the documentation that have come from the Department of the Environment fully supports Surrey going statutory footing, and it's, I understand from the department that it is the intention that this will be placed before the new government, the first quarter of the new government, which will be considered by Cabinet for registration. So it's still all systems go. We have a registration board in place. There are 4 to 5 government departments represented on that registration board, including the Department of the Environment, Department of Education and Skills, and various other state agencies. So yes, Surrey is still in operation. There's no operation to proceed, and government support for it is still there at statutory level.
Okay, we might show our appreciation for our panel.